Our first session today is a dive into the treacherous world of politics, and specifically the politics of the person occupying the White House right now. And one particular quote uttered in just the past, well, in the days before he ordered the strikes against the nuclear sites in Iran, to me, I think underscores his overarching philosophy of governing, if there is such a philosophy, and also explains a bit about his approach to international trade, which we're going to discuss as well. And you may have read this quote, but I'm just going to read it to you anyway. I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do. I like to make a final decision 1 minute before it's due. There you go. Which brings us to our next speaker. You have to be tireless to track and analyze the far-reaching political and economic implications of Donald Trump's second term in the White House. Steve Okun is that and more. His sharp analyses at the intersection of politics and foreign policy are must-haves as we all attempt to make sense and find meaning during the frenetic news cycles fueled by the White House strategy of flood the zone. And I'm sure you've all heard that strategy. Steve is CEO and founder of the public affairs and sustainability firm, APAC Advisors. He was both chair of AmChams of Asia Pacific and AmCham Singapore. As a member of the Clinton administration, he served as deputy counsel at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Please welcome Steve.
Kevin, thank you so much. So today we'll talk about Trump 2.0, and I call this presentation Beyond Borders because we'll talk about what's happening in Washington and in the U.S., but then also what it means for those of us who live and work in Asia Pacific. So I was almost exactly to the day 1 year ago that I was in this room with your predecessors. So I really love doing this. It is amazing how much has changed since the presentation I gave last year, where we thought maybe it was going to be President Harris. And now the world is completely different. Other than my pants, I figured out, I just realized I'm wearing the same exact pants I wore a year ago. So other than my pants in this room, we have a completely different presentation this year than the one I gave last year. I think literally there's only one slide that is going to repeat. So as Kevin said, I worked in the White House, and then I worked in the Clinton administration. Thank you very much for not laughing at that picture. No, I disclose this because I say, look, I'm a Democrat. I'm still supportive of Democratic policies. But two things. First, I take my Democratic hat off to do this presentation. You do not want to hear Democratic talking points. It doesn't make any sense. So I'm just trying to give you straight analysis, both politics and geopolitics in trade. And then I'll also say from a trade perspective, historically, there had never been any real differences between Democrats and Republicans. It wasn't like one side was pro-trade and the other was not. And I'll make the argument in the past 3 decades, the two most consequential and important presidents from a trade perspective, from a global perspective, were the Democrats. It was Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Not that George W. Bush wasn't pro-trade as well, but it was Clinton who got NAFTA signed. It was Obama who got Korea signed, and it was Obama who brought in TPP. Of course, that didn't happen. So that's just my way of giving you my quick background. And I'll just say, in terms of the ground rules today, no ground rules. So ask whatever questions you want to ask. I'll pause at various parts, but if you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll go straight into Q&A. So this is a slide, I'll bring it home to Asia now. This is a slide I used in December 2023 when I started doing presentations on the coming election. And I said that Asia needed to get ready for a Trump 2.0. Right, this is what we had to be expecting. And I think this turned out to be pretty accurate. Now, where we are a year and a half later, okay, it's not quite this bad yet, but the damage that is being done to the global trading system, the impact that it's having in Asia of the Trump 2.0 administration, and what is going to be coming, and it could be in the days, weeks, or months to follow, is something that we have to really understand and think through, and then figure out how are businesses, investors, governments all going to react to what's happening in Washington. So here in Singapore, Singapore is bracing for impact. They know that their export sectors are going to get hit from declining external demand. Jobs and wages are going to be under pressure. There are going to be rising retrenchments here. Business confidence is dropping and investments are being delayed, both for geopolitical reasons and geoeconomic reasons. So this is having a real impact in real time, Trump 2.0. And why has this happened? Because look, the top geopolitical risks in the last year have shifted dramatically. This were the top geopolitical risks in 2024. The top concern were higher energy prices. These are from CEOs. Higher energy prices, cyber attacks. Those were the top two. A global trade war, that was number 10. And so what has happened in the past year is that 3 of these risks, now that Donald Trump is in the White House, have dropped off the top 10. It's in higher food prices due to conflict and inflation. That was a real concern with the Russian invasion in Ukraine and what was going to happen with rising grain prices and the like. So some of these have dropped off. And what has happened in 2025 with the risks that we have with Donald Trump in the White House, intensified global trade wars. That goes from the 10th list, the number 10, to number 1. Decoupling or de-risking from China goes from number 8 to number 4. The U.S. national debt and deficits goes to number 5 from number 7. So you see an increase in certain geopolitical risks with Donald Trump in the White House, something that all of us in the region are watching and then figuring out how we're going to react to all of this. And so now we have new risks. And number 8, which was not there before, right? War in the Middle East expands. That was number 3, dropped to under number 8 under Donald Trump with his America First non-interventionist policy. Of course, that all changed this past weekend. That will go up much higher the next time there is the next time there is one of these surveys done. So we can really see how much of an impact one person has, one administration has in changing all of the geopolitical risks that we have to face. And that's why we really have to study what's happening in Washington, because that is what is driving all of this. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump, it's very simple, right? Believe him. Believe him with what he says. And when you believe Donald Trump, then you know what he is going to do. Now, this applies most of the time, right? So I wrote about this before the election. I said America First would become Trump First in his second term. It was America First, Trump 1.0. It's Trump First in his second term. And they made very clear, the campaign made very clear, Donald Trump made very clear, the America First team made very clear that they were going to do things much differently in Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0. And we can see this playing out, and we're seeing it play out in the Iran decision, right? In Trump 1.0, they had real establishment Republicans in those national security positions. Right, you had Mattis, and you had McMaster, and you had Tillerson, right, and you had Esper later on, right? Though that was the national security team. Do you think Donald Trump would have done this in his first term with that national security team? Obviously, we'll never know because circumstances changed quite greatly in the past year in Iran, certainly even from Trump 1.0. But that was who he had. Who does he have in Trump 2.0? It's all about being loyal to him. It's not about experience. It's about loyalty. Pete Hegseth, as the Secretary of Defense, is the prime example of that. And so that understanding that it is Trump first, not America first, you can then start to understand a lot of what's happening. You can start to understand why USAID essentially doesn't exist anymore. You can understand what is happening with immigration and deportations today as opposed to Trump 1.0. He didn't change much on immigration, but his team and the authorities they used have changed greatly. So believe him when he tells you he wants to deport 10 million people. That is what he believes. The second thing that my Clinton colleague, Thurgood Marshall Jr. and I wrote just before the inauguration was that Trump was going to be the most powerful U.S. president since Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt had a lot of power because he was a wartime president, and that Donald Trump was going to have a lot of power. Not because he was going to be a wartime president and the power that comes with that, but that all the guardrails that had been in place against presidential power, Congress being an effective check on the president, the media being an effective check on the president, the business community being an effective check on the president's own team being an effective check sometimes on the president. All those guardrails have gone away. All that we have left is the market. And the market works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. We can talk a bit about that more to try and figure out when is Donald Trump going to face that check. And finally, he was very clear that he was going to put tariffs on everybody. This was no surprise. And so now we have the nightmare scenario of Trump's tariffs heading towards Asia. See, he said he was going to do this during the campaign. And so that's my main lesson. If you really want to understand Donald Trump and what he might be doing, just listen to him and believe him. And when he has control over something, he will act on it. He has no control of solving Russia-Ukraine in 24 hours. So you can ignore when he says something like that. But when he has the power to deport people, when he has the power to increase tariffs, then he is going to act on that. And you saw him act on that over this weekend as well with the attack in Iran. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this last guardrail, because I think people are misunderstanding a bit when we have this new phrase, TACO. Does everybody know what TACO stands for? What's it stand for? Okay, Trump always chickens out. That's not true. There are times he chickens out. He does not always chicken out. So we need to kind of understand when is he going to chicken out, and then that can also help us think through what is he going to do and when is he going to act. And so this is, you know, what Thurgood and I wrote about in that commentary I mentioned briefly before. Right, the market is a guardrail. Right, that is the one guardrail. But the market works as a guardrail when you're really going to damage the market. And if he is going to take action that isn't going to damage the market, certainly not in the short term, then TACO doesn't work. And I saw when Trump said that he was going, he said, well, we're going to take out Iran, all right? Or we're going to take out the nuclear facilities. And then he said, no, I'm going to give them 2 weeks. And somebody then said, oh, that's TACO. No, you got that person got it entirely wrong. That was not Trump chickening out at all, because the market didn't move. Oil prices didn't move yet, right? So we don't know what's going to happen when it comes to what he's going to do. So you can only use the market as a guardrail prediction when we see if he is going to take action and it's really going to hammer the market. And rare earths in China might be one of those instances where we're going to watch what happens. There, you really could have the market acting as a guardrail. Vietnam getting hit with 46% tariffs, that is not going to impact the market. The market is not going to act as a guardrail there. There are going to be other situations where he may or may not change tariffs in Vietnam, but it is not going to be TACO. So keep TACO in mind, but I think it's clever, but I think it's a little bit too much. Yep.
Christian Davis from the Financial Times. It was my colleague who coined TACO, which is why I'm going to defend it slightly. When you mention the market, I mean, people, when they say the market, they often mean the stock market, but actually it's really the bond market, yes, which Trump seems to have responded to. And at least on the reciprocal tariffs, it seems to have been the bond market that did spook him, and he did end up chickening out on that.
No, I say TACO works in a very limited way, and I agree with that. But TACO doesn't work with foreign policy pretty much. And now we'll see maybe if it changes down the road. But yeah, TACO works. Certainly, the bond market is the most important. So I agree with it. It's just that it's gotten taken out of context. I think it's too much now when you start applying it around. All right. Now, the other thing to remember about Donald Trump and how different he is from any other president, and I just say, believe him when he says that he owns the store, right? What did Donald Trump said? He said, the United States, it's a giant, beautiful store, and everyone wants to go shopping there. And on behalf of the American people, I own the store. I set the prices, and I'll say, if you want to shop here, this is what you have to pay. This is his philosophy when it comes to trade. This is his philosophy when it comes to negotiating trade agreements. Vietnam, you want to export to the United States? You will do what I say because this is my store. It's not Congress's store. It's not anybody else's store. It's his store. So he does mean this, right? And we can see this playing out. So keep this in mind as we're going through all of these tariff negotiations as we approach the magical non-binding deadline of July 9th, which we'll talk about in a moment. So now I want to talk about U.S.-China because you really have to understand U.S.-China if you want to understand what's happening throughout Asia. Right? And the thing that you have to remember, I think, the most, because a lot of people come in and say, oh, well, why is Trump tariffing China? Why is it that Trump is taking all of these actions against China? Why is what he is doing in 2024 or 2025 so different? You have to understand that the United States view of China is pretty bipartisan, and it has been a long time coming. When I first started going to China in 1999, 2000, when I started working really closely in China, Americans had a majority favorability view towards China. People were jealous that I was going to China. Most Americans hadn't been there yet. I started going kind of in the first wave of when it was really just starting to open up. And people were jealous that I was going to China. What is it like? Where should I go? How exciting is it? How much is it changing? Isn't this great? Aren't they going to become more and more like us? Aren't we going to do more and more together? So this was the American view of China. And I will argue that it is not the Americans who changed over the last 25 years or so. The change has come in China. And it is the change that has happened in China in the last 25 years, and really in the last 15 years or so, that has driven what is now happening in the United States. So if you look at the year, it's about 2012 when the United States flipped. When the United States population flipped from having a positive view of China to a negative view of China. That flip occurred not because of anything that happened in the United States. It is because of what was happening in China. And so what started to happen in China in 2012, right? You started to get Made in China 2025 started to come in there. Indigenous innovation had been, that policy had preceded it. You started to have different actions in the South China Sea, towards Taiwan, towards Hong Kong, towards Xinjiang. All of these things came together, and certainly the Chinese leadership changed then. And that is what drove the United States to take a much different position towards China than it had before. So this is a reaction. And this is what you have to understand. It's not what changed in Washington. It's what changed in Beijing, which caused the change in Washington, which is why we are where we are today. So what is it that China started to do, in particular, towards the business community and the investment community in 2015? They came out with Made in China 2025. And so this was a decade ago. And China said, we are going to dominate the 10 most important sectors for the 21st century. And we are going to use all of the power of the state to do that. And so this was their policy. This was their industrial policy that they came out with in 2015. And it has been a very successful policy. If we look at what happened with electric vehicles is one example. Go back to 2018 and EVs. China did okay, the US did okay, the EU did okay. Now China dominates the EV sector. And this is a direct result of the state policies that came out in Made in China 2025. And I can use different parts of Made in China to show where they are dominating all of those key sectors or starting to dominate those key sectors of the 21st century. So not only did you have the Made in China 2025 policy, but they also had a policy towards dual circulation, right? So dual circulation is that China will export all of these key 21st century in all these key 21st century sectors, and of course other non-priority sectors as well. So China is going to have an export market, but that for its domestic market, it's going to lock that up. And so it's going to be China for China within China, and then we're going to have China to export. And this has also been an extraordinarily successful policy, because if you see what happens in the last 30 years or so, Chinese reliance on the U.S. has fallen significantly, yet American reliance on China has gone up greatly. This is not sustainable from a U.S. perspective. This is not a Trump thing. It's not a Republican thing. It's not a MAGA thing. This is an American thing. This can't sustain. And U.S. policy had to change. And so the U.S. has shifted from a policy of engage and accommodate, right? That was the policy. I don't know if you want to put Jimmy Carter's name on it, or if you want to put Reagan's name on it, or Clinton's name on it, or H.W. Bush's name on it. But the bipartisan policy towards China had always been, we will engage with China, we will bring them into the global rules-based trading system, and we will accommodate their rise as they do so. We will allow them to continue to use state subsidies, and we will continue to allow them to put up all of these restrictions to exports. Because as we engage with them and as we accommodate them, they're going to become more like us. They're going to buy into the global rules-based trading system, and they will be partners with us and the Japanese and the Europeans and the Singaporeans and everybody else. Well, engage and accommodate didn't work. Now, you could say that it was the Chinese who changed, that they were on the path to becoming into the global rules-based trading system, and then they veered off it. Or you could say that was a ridiculous presumption on the part of the Americans and others, and they were never going to do that anyway. But doesn't matter whether it was why it didn't come out the way it did. It didn't come out the way it did. And so the United States changed. And so the United States position went from engage and accommodate to confront. And we're going to confront China as Americans. Why? Because China threatens American businesses and workers. Because China uses unfair non-market practices. Because China engages in forced technology transfers and intellectual property theft. And all of that has damaged the United States. Now, do you know who said this? This was not Donald Trump. This was Joe Biden. Joe Biden said this, his administration said this just over a year ago. And so this is bipartisan. This is very much where the Americans are when it comes to China. And it's not just the Americans. The world responds to China the same way. Everybody is tariffing China when it comes to electric vehicles. Why is that? Because you need to have an auto industry in your own country. If you don't have a domestic auto industry, then you are going to really harm yourself when it comes to your national security. Who's going to produce your tanks? Who's going to produce your armored personnel vehicles and other things you need for your military? So you have to protect your domestic auto industry. And if you're not if China's going to come in and wipe out if they're going to dominate EVs and you're not going to have EVs, then you're not going to have your other parts of your auto sector, and then you're in trouble. And so it's not an American thing. This is not just about the U.S. versus China. So I think that's one thing we all have to keep in mind. I'll pause here, and then I'll talk about where the U.S. and China may go next. Yep.
Hi, Katya Dmitrieva from Bloomberg News. I was just thinking, as you're talking about, there was that great chart you showed from OECD of China's reliance on the U.S. versus U.S. reliance on China. And I'm wondering if you see a world where the U.S. can actually cut its reliance on China at this point, because and in some ways, the current tariff policy counteracts that, right? Because if you want other countries to start producing things, which, by the way, probably have inputs coming from China, whether it says so on the item or not, high tariffs in those countries will not necessarily help that. So do you see a way for the U.S. to do that? Are they doing it right at the moment? Yeah, would be interesting.
Okay. That's about my next 10 slides. So I will answer all of those questions. But I'll start with the next one. But does anyone have any other question on U.S.-China before we'll go? Katya, I will try and answer everything you just asked. That I can. Some of it is who knows, right? But I'll do what I can.
So I wanted to ask if China is really an aberration, because historically, when UK was an industrial power, others kind of raised their protection to protect themselves from UK goods, and then Germany became a manufacturing hub, and this imitation was always part of the game. Then there was Japan, and US had problems with Japan, and now US has problem with China, and in future maybe US will have a problem with India. I mean, is China really an aberration? Is what I want to know.
No, I mean, I think China is different just because, in part, because of its size. Obviously, it makes it very different because that there is a rules-based system that it hasn't been playing by. I mean, I think that is the view of most of the countries that are dealing with China, and so it makes it and it's the government that it has. It's you put all of that together, and you have to treat China differently than any of the other examples that you just gave. Did you have one more, Christian?
Christian Davis from the FT. Yeah, I think the Japan comparison is really interesting, because if we were in the 1980s, we'd be talking about Japan is also doing this, Japan is doing that. And obviously, as you say, China is a much bigger country and a different political system and so on. But there's always a sense from other countries that America tends to panic about countries that challenge its dominance, and that it's not just about the different political system, it's about maintaining dominance. It's not necessarily my view, but I think it's a valid
No,
question.
I think that is why, what is led to where U.S.-China is today, and where is it going to go, and how much of it is politics, how much of it is the Thucydides trap, and all of those we're watching there. But I think from if you want to watch it from a trade perspective, the actions the U.S. took against Japan in the 80s, it's not the same situation, but it took a lot of those tariff actions. It took a lot of the same types of actions. But I think you can't make the comparison in terms of globalization in the 80s and where we are today. All right.
Follow up what Christian just asked. I'm Frank from Thai PBS. So just want to understand, do you think right now Trump's administration has implemented is to push away US allies to China, or just to intensify the regionalization in the bloc?
We'll get to, I'll answer that, and then we'll go on to our next question. But I mean, I'll go on to the next set of slides. But I mean, that is the difference between, right? If you want the real difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration, which is basically every administration that existed before the Trump administration and the Trump administration, is that the U.S. approach was work with partners and allies. Right? And we were going to work with partners and allies, and certainly in the Biden administration approach was, let's work with partners and allies against China's economic aggression, against China's Made in China 2025 policies, against China's dumping of its excess capacity into all of our markets. That was the approach of the Biden administration. Let's make our supply chains more resilient by working together, and that was one of the key pillars of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which Donald Trump dumped on, I think, his first day in office. He waited till day 3 to get rid of CPTP, or to get rid of TPP. IPEF went away, I think it was day 1 or close to it. And so the Trump approach is that we are strongest as the United States when we work bilaterally. And that our bilateral approach is what is going to advance U.S. national security the greatest. That is what is going to bring us the more jobs. That is what is going to bring the most investment to us. And that is what is going to enable us to compete with China. And so it's a very different approach. Both the United States foreign policy towards China, economic policy towards China hasn't changed, but how you get there has changed greatly. Personally, I am much more into the traditional U.S. camp of working with partners and allies, but that is not where we are now. And so the question is, where is it that the Trump administration is going to go? And there are three scenarios that we're going to watch to play out as we get there. Katya, I think this starts to answer your question, right? So the Biden administration and other administrations and the Obama administration, they looked at China as a competitor, right? As a strategic competitor, and that you deal with them as a strategic competitor. If you're a strategic competitor, sometimes you work together, and sometimes you have to confront your strategic competitor. But the Trump administration, and Secretary Rubio has used these terms, and others have used even stronger terms, doesn't view China as a strategic competitor, views China as an adversary, views China as the most advanced adversary America has ever faced. And when you look at China from that perspective, the policies that you are going to implement against an adversary are very different than the policies you're going to implement as a strategic competitor. And so what is it that Secretary Rubio says about China? That if we stay on the same road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. So if that is your mindset, and that is the mindset of the majority of the Trump administration when it comes to economic engagement with China, right? So if that's your mindset, where are you going to go? And I think there are three scenarios that we can see come forward for U.S.-China going forward. The first one I'll call status quo plus, right? That is what we have today. That is what the Trump administration started in Trump 1.0. It is what the Biden administration continued on in his administration, and it is what Trump has now. And that's small yard, high fence, right? So the United States is going to engage economically with China from a trade and investment perspective on everything except what we put in this yard. We're going to have a small yard where we're going to say, you can't engage with China. You can't engage with China on certain semiconductors when it comes to artificial intelligence. Certainly, military would be in there. Other types of systems that can be used for dual use. All of those things get put into this small yard. Now, and you have put a high fence around that yard and you say everything else is okay. Now, the yard's going to get bigger under Trump 2.0 than it was under Trump 1.0 or under Biden, but it's still going to be a small yard. It's going to have a yard and a fence component to it. That's option one. Option two is moving towards strategic decoupling. And that is not small yard, high fence, but we're going to go, that yard's going to get to be a lot bigger. It's still going to be a yard, but it's going to be a lot bigger. And we are going to put limits on trade and investment with the PRC. And now the question, which we'll talk about later, are those trade and limits on investment with the PRC, does that apply to the United States, or does that apply extraterritorial? Is there an extraterritorial application beyond the United States? And we'll talk about that in a moment. So are we going to see strategic decoupling, or are we going to see decoupling? Are we going to see massive limits on trade and investment with China to the greatest extent possible? Now, all three of these scenarios are in play right now. We don't know which one the Trump administration is going to pursue. I can argue that it's status quo plus, and I can argue it's strategic decoupling right now. And this is something we are all going to have to watch, because this is going to really drive what the allies are going to do, what the partners are going to do, what people who are trading and investing with China are going to do. So we're really at the precipice of trying to see the next direction of global trade, and it is going to be driven by this decision on U.S. In China. So what do we see happening as a result of U.S. action so far, plus what naturally happens with China, is that China outbound investment is increasing. And so as we all talk about having a China plus one strategy, right? That companies have to have a China plus one. We learned that in part, right, because of COVID zero, and you saw all the political risk happen when everybody had their entire supply chains in China, and then COVID zero happens, and your entire supply chain gets shut down. You need to diversify out of China. The tariffs that Trump put on meant you needed to diversify out of China. So we saw a China plus one strategy, but that China plus one is not just the Americans and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans. It's the Chinese are China plus one as well. And we see outbound investment coming out of China at an ever increasing rate. And a lot of that is coming here, right? Southeast Asia is becoming a manufacturing hub for Chinese investments. And a lot of that, some of that has to do with tariffs. A little bit of that has to do that you want to diversify if you're Chinese out of China as well. Part of that is rising costs in China. You saw diversification out of Japan as Japan got more expensive. Factories went to China. This is just part of that continuation. So all three of these things are bringing a lot more investment out of China, and a lot of that investment is coming here. And so the U.S. is focusing on this. The U.S. is saying, why are all of these, we see all of these exports from China going to Southeast Asia, and we see all of this investment coming in to Southeast Asia. Is that investment for Southeast Asia? Is that to serve the ASEAN market, or is that to serve the U.S. market, and they're just doing it and flowing it over China? Right, so that is something that is also being part of these tariff negotiations that we're watching right now. And now that we see trade and national security colliding, and we see the small yard getting bigger, if not moving straight to strategic decoupling, you can't just make a product in China, ship it to Vietnam, slap a label on top of it, and now say it's a Vietnamese product. Now, this would be illegal under any, currently this would be illegal. That's tariff, the circumvention. You can't do that. You have to transform the product when you ship it. But this is what we see happening is, that the U.S. in particular is very concerned about, are all of these transshipments. And so as supply chains are becoming China plus one, tariffs are going to become China plus one, and investment restrictions are going to become China plus one. And all of this is playing out in the negotiations that are taking place and have taken place and are going to take place this week and next week with all the trading partners of the United States as we get to July 9th. So, right, so Liberation Day, right, the Liberation Day tariffs on Southeast Asia, which the president announced in the Rose Garden, hit Southeast Asia pretty hard. Right, 10% is the floor. 10% is the new universal tariff. So Singapore gets 10% because Singapore has a trade deficit with the United States. U.S. has a trade surplus with Singapore. Other than that, we kind of know how these numbers came out. But you see the reciprocal tariffs that the president has levied against Southeast Asia with Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam and Myanmar, all up in the 40s. And all of these negotiations are taking place, and countries like Cambodia and Vietnam in particular, we're all watching, cannot live with a 46% tariff again with the United States. They have too much of their economy exposed, so they are negotiating with the U.S. to get that tariff knocked down. It won't get below 10, and the question is, what will it be between 10 and 46, and what do the Vietnamese have to do with the United States to get that tariff reduced, right? And so this is something that gets into that trade circumvention, because a lot of those exports from China to ASEAN are going to Vietnam, which are then making their way to the United States. And the question is this trade or is this transshipment? Is this allowed or is this not allowed? And one of the things that Ambassador Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, said is that we're going to have to modify how we consider transshipments to take place. Because if these Chinese companies are benefiting from unfair trade practices like state subsidies or what have you in China, they can't take that benefit and bring it down to Vietnam and then ship it to the US. So while that may be legal today, what they're doing, we may have to change the rules when it comes to tariff circumvention. And we're going to make things that are allowed today not allowed. And this is going to have a huge impact on everybody if these rules, when it comes to trade, change. Now, Malaysia is urging Chinese firms to avoid using it to dodge U.S. tariffs. Right? So you're seeing this pushback against China across Southeast Asia. This is not just something that the Americans are concerned with. They're concerned with it too. But Southeast Asian countries don't want to see investment coming into their countries and then all the benefits flowing back to China. They don't want to see that. They want to see that if you're going to invest in Malaysia, create Malaysian jobs, help the Malaysian economy. So this is playing out across Southeast Asia, all these reverberations of the U.S.-China trade war. And so I had mentioned, are we having small yard, high fence, or are we moving towards strategic decoupling, right? This is an example of strategic decoupling in action. This was from last week, or 2 weeks ago now, where the U.S. is pushing Vietnam to decouple from Chinese tech. This is part of the negotiations between the U.S. and Vietnam. And in reading the reports, the U.S. says, if you want us to lower those reciprocal tariffs below 46%, you have to decouple from China. And so Vietnam is being asked to reduce its dependency on Chinese high tech, and that this is part of the restructuring of all of these global supply chains. And then this is going to reduce U.S. dependence on Chinese components, even though they're coming from Vietnam. And this is, right, the ultimate objective of this is to speed up U.S. decoupling from Chinese high tech while increasing Vietnam's industrial capacity. This is really, this is really significant, and we really want to watch what happens with the U.S.-Vietnam negotiations, because when we see what Vietnam has agreed to, if it agrees to anything when it comes to China and decoupling as part of access to the U.S. domestic market, we will have a lot more of an insight into where the Trump administration is going in terms of strategic decoupling, further than that or less than that. All right, and then I think this was, I might have been I think maybe this was your question, Christian, but we don't know what the Trump administration is trying, right, to accomplish, right? Because the U.S. wants to see that there is manufacturing in the U.S. for the U.S., but the U.S. also wants to have manufacturing in the U.S. to export to the world. And tariffs are kind of at cross purposes when it comes to that. Because if you're using tariffs to force onshoring, to bring that manufacturing to the U.S., then you want to keep the tariffs high, right? Because then it makes sense to leave Vietnam or leave Malaysia or wherever because the tariffs are too high, and it becomes cheaper and more economical to have your factory in the United States. So there you want to keep your tariffs high. However, if you want to have, say to Vietnam, we want you to decouple from China and we're going to lower our tariffs on you in exchange for doing that, well, now you're not going to bring investment back to the U.S. because you've cut tariffs. So what is it that they're trying to use tariffs for? Are tariffs being used to decouple? Are tariffs used to increase FDI into the United States? It's really hard to say that they can be used for both simultaneously. Now, maybe there's a way for the Trump administration to do this. Maybe there's a way for USTR to negotiate it. We're going to have to watch. But there is an inherent contradiction in what they're trying to accomplish through tariffs. And we don't know which way it's going to turn out. Did that answer your question, Katya? Follow up.
The issue of transshipments is super interesting. I wonder if the tariffs actually encourage more of that to happen, because what I've heard from businesses, for example, is like they're seeing that divide between Chinese tariffs up here, rest of Southeast Asia down here, and they're exploiting that by just because it's lower in Vietnam or Malaysia or wherever. So do you see those the tariffs as potentially encouraging more of that kind of illegal behavior?
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, yes. If tariffs become so high from China to the U.S., it encourages you to transship if they're also high from Vietnam. And so, how do you stop that? And how do you change? So there's a couple things that certainly the U.S. government will be looking at is how do you have more inspections? Right? Do you change ownership laws? Do you put more enforcement into place? Do you require the countries to do more enforcing? All of these things, right, are going to be a reaction to that. So you have the governmental reaction, but then you also have the business reaction, and we see this happening already. So is there a way to change how you can you consolidate shipments and get a lower tariff price if you bundle invoices? Can you split the IP off of a product? And so if the product is being shipped, if it's a computer chip being shipped from Vietnam to the United States, and a Vietnamese company owns the IP, that computer chip is worth I'm making up a number now, right? Worth $100. If the U.S. company owns the IP and the computer chip is just the silicon and whatever goes into it, but the IP is owned in the United States, the value of that chip is $10. So do you split off IP? Can you split off IP if you sell a T-shirt that has Mickey Mouse on it and it gets manufactured in Vietnam, right? That T-shirt is only worth $1 or even less because the value is in the copyright in the Mickey Mouse. So can you split off IP? There's all of things that businesses are trying to look at. Are there ways to change how we do business to address an increase in tariffs? Then governments are looking at it. It's all in play right now. So Katya, it's a great question, and it's what everybody's trying to figure out. Yep.
Thank you, Steven. I'm Yujie from South China Morning Post.
Mhm.
I cover a lot about EVs and energy solar panels. So there are some Chinese companies that are already localizing their production to US. So I'm curious about what happens after this kind of onshoring. Because a lot of companies, they're concerned that after they set up these factories in the US, will there be further restrictions for them to, for example, forcing them to hand the control to homegrown companies?
Oh, it's a really interesting question that like the real trade experts, I see Merle back there and Junwei, right, at Hinrich are trying to figure out is that it used to be when you looked at trade, the question was, where is the good manufactured? And you looked at where the good was manufactured, and that's where it was from. Now, the question is not going to be where is the good, what might not be where is the good is manufactured, it's who owns the manufacturer. And if it's who owns the manufacturer, if it's made in the United States or made in Vietnam or made in China, but it's owned by the Chinese, is that a Chinese good? And so that's the question that we don't know the answer to yet. Are we going to change how trade is being, how you determine the origin of a good? Is it who owns it, or is it where it's made? And if it's who owns it, that is a whole different set of complexities that we're all going to have to start working through.
Hi, I'm Shreya from Business Standard newspaper in India. So, getting back to the point of the rules of origin, wouldn't it make the entire process more and more complicated, because tweaking rules of origin won't be that easy, and with different countries having different sort of tariffs, if US levies different tariffs on different countries, how do we see see things going ahead?
Yes, and it's going to be a lot more expensive. Yes, it's going to be very complicated, and it's going to have to be expensive to have to figure all of this out.
And is it practically possible to implement these changes? Is it practical? I mean, one thing is to announce and sort of send a signal that people shouldn't be using other countries to route products to US. But is it even practically possible to implement this on such a scale?
Okay, is it practical? No. Is it possible? Yes. It is going to be very expensive. And this is why once we see where these rules are going, the business community is really going to have to work with customs officials and trade officials to help them understand how complex this is, and can we even do this? We have to have rules that are implementable. But I don't think there's any question trade compliance costs are going up. I mean, that is going to happen. The question is how much. Right now, I would just say one other point I want to make is that we've talked all about tariffs, but the United States and other businesses, and forget United States, businesses have real concerns of what we call non-tariff barriers. And what we want to watch in these negotiations as well is not only is the subject going to be just, let's use Vietnam, because this is a Vietnam example. Not only will the U.S. and Vietnam be negotiating tariffs, and not only will they be negotiating how much will Vietnam be purchasing from the U.S. to lower its trade imbalance, not only how much is Vietnam going to be investing into the United States, and not only how much is Vietnam going to be able to decouple from China, but we have, from a business perspective, one of the most important issues is Vietnam going to address the non-tariff barriers that businesses and investors face. And so AmCham Vietnam came out with a list of 7 categories of non-tariff barriers that we want USTR to address in these negotiations with the government of Vietnam. I'm not going to read all of them, but just kind of as an example, transferring money out of Vietnam is complex, costly, and time-consuming. And the requirements that the Vietnamese put on businesses go well beyond anti-money laundering. And it more appears to function as an informal capital control. That is a non-tariff barrier. Customs puts up a lot of non-tariff barriers because they will often apply the HS code that carries the highest tariff, regardless of what you declare. And now importers are required to pay that higher duty, creating financial strain. Sometimes they get the money back, but it takes months and months and months for that to happen. That should not be happening in Vietnam right now. So there are legitimate, very serious trade concerns that businesses and investors have with countries that go beyond, that should be part of these reciprocal tariff negotiations. So this is something that we'd like to see happen as well, and it is something that the business community is communicating to the U.S. government. And what we also want to argue, which gets back, I think, Christian, to one of your points, is that the U.S. industrial base needs to export. And so often the difficulty in exporting to a country like Vietnam, many countries have non-tariff barriers. I'm just using Vietnam as an example. But that if you reduce non-tariff barriers, you're going to increase the U.S. Exports to those countries. And that ties into exactly what the Trump administration wants. So hopefully this will all come together in these negotiations. But the thing that we're all watching, and we touched on these as a little bit of a summary page, businesses and investors need certainty when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to trade. And countries need certainty as well. Now, the Trump team said they're going to do 90 deals in 90 days. Experts say good luck with that. I would put myself in that category, but we are seeing movement certainly in certain countries on these trade deals. But there's a lot of things that are still open questions. So, for example, relative tariffs are really important. So, if Vietnam negotiates with the United States and they're first, and let's say they get their tariff down from 46% to 25%, is that a good deal or is that a bad deal? You don't know. And if Thailand and Malaysia, some of the competitors of Vietnam, come in at a 15% rate, it's a terrible deal. So if you're Vietnam, are you going to take that deal for 25%? Or are you going to risk getting hit with a 46% tariff, which we know would be very detrimental to the Vietnamese economy? Will the United States give Vietnam a most favorable nation provision? So Vietnam, you go first, you're at 25%, but if one of your neighbors comes in at 15, we'll give you 15. That we don't know is being discussed, haven't heard it's being discussed, but that's something that's really critical. A second thing that's really critical is whether Section 232 will apply post-agreement. So what do I mean by that? Section 232 are national security tariffs. Right, so national security tariffs, right? There are, I think, 9 investigations going on right now. It's semiconductor, but it's copper, it's rare earths, it's aluminum, it's steel, it's jet engines. I think there's 9 of them going on right now. So if Vietnam or pick a country, Japan, Korea, whoever, comes to an agreement with the United States, says, okay, we get our tariffs down to 15%. Oh, now we're going to hit you with steel and aluminum at 50%, or we're going to hit you with rare earths, or we're going to hit you with pharmaceuticals, which is a real critical sector that everybody's watching here. Then what happens? So now you've made all of your best deals, you've cut the best deal you possibly can, and your tariffs go back up, and there's nothing you can do about it. One of the things that the business community is really focused on is once these deals go into place, is there some type of dispute settlement process? How do we know that if the U.S. negotiates with Vietnam, it comes in at 15%, 20%, whatever the number is. So now U.S. investment goes back into Vietnam because now we know, and everybody's investment goes back into Vietnam because we know what the tariffs are. Well, what happens if the U.S. says, oh, Vietnam, you promised to get your trade deficit down. You didn't. Back up to 46% tomorrow. Well, now businesses and investors and Vietnam, of course, are very much in a very detrimental position. So is there going to be some type of expectation of stability? So all of these things are still playing out, which is why we can't answer what's going to happen and what the Trump administration policy is, because they haven't made any of these decisions yet. So two blind spots that we kind of see the United States having, or certainly I see the United States having, is that one, the U.S. has no strategic empathy when it comes to other countries. When the U.S. says, we need you to decouple from China. Well, the Vietnamese, the Singaporeans, all of Southeast Asia says, no, we need to stay engaged with China. Well, the U.S. says, we don't care. So there's no strategic empathy. And the U.S. does not understand China has a lot of leverage. China has a great deal of leverage, not only of the United States, which we saw in the London talks, but China has a lot of leverage, more leverage in this part of the world. So those are the type of things we're going to have to watch. I know we're coming up on the end of time, so I'll just say we'll go to my last slide, and then we'll take a question, then we'll see where we have to go. So what are we worried about with all of this going on as businesses is that I wrote this for the Nikkei. I know Grace is over there. I think I wrote this about a month ago. What we see happening that we're all having to live with is the collapse of brand America under Trump, that lack of strategic empathy, looking at countries from a bilateral perspective, not working with partners and allies. All of these things are really going to have something else that American companies have to be in place. And so now your nightmare scenario that you used to do strategic planning for is your base case. We have a global tariff war coming, where we're in the middle of a global tariff war. We have the unraveling of the international trading system. Sanctions and tariffs are now part of tools of national security. And so trade is now part of national security. Customs is being disrupted, and strategic alliances are being disordered. So with that, I'll say, reach out to me anytime, email, WhatsApp. Noemi can raise her hand. Noemi's with me. She can copy her as well, and we're happy to always be in touch. All right. Any time left, Kevin, or is that it? Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
Yep.
Suhan from Bloomberg News. So do you think these changes we're seeing in the global trade order, do you think this will stick around after Trump's 4 years, or do you think we will see some sort of backstabbing if there's new government?
No, the rules have changed, and they are going to remain changed. Now, the question is, it depends who wins, right, in the United States, and what policies will they bring in. If we get, President Donald Trump Jr. or President J.D. Vance or President Marco Rubio, then this is going to stay. If you had a Nikki Haley or you had somebody like Gavin Newsom, you'd see a walk back. But the question will be, who can trust the United States, right? You fool me once, shame on you, because we all said, oh, Trump was an aberration when it came to the global system in America first, and Joe Biden's going to be back in that trajectory like every other predecessor he had, Republican and Democrat, when it came to working with allies and partners. And now we got Trump 2.0. No one goes, all right, so maybe Haley wins, but who's going to say who's going to win after that? So no, the changes are permanent. The question is how much of the changes are permanent and how much can come back. And let's see what the Trump administration requires of countries when it comes to strategic decoupling. So all of those things are up in the air.
Thanks. One more question on the trade negotiations. Like you talked about non-tariff barriers, but other than that, for U.S. trading partners, do you think these deals could do any good for the U.S. partners when it comes to trade negotiations? Or would it be just, like, realistically speaking, focused on minimizing the impact from these tariffs?
No, I mean, it's mostly about minimizing the impact. I mean, if everybody is at a relatively same base rate of 10%, and it seems that 10% is the floor, where no one is going to go below 10%. If everybody's at the same relative amount, then things will be okay. And the Trump administration is, as was the Biden administration, is correct. We, the world, have become and allowed ourselves to become too reliant on a single country. And we have to diversify out of that. And this is certainly speeding up that process, and that needs to happen. And that was happening under President Biden. It's probably going to happen faster than under Harris, than it will under Trump. So all of these things will continue without question. Some of them would have happened regardless of who's president. But with this president and this administration and this policy, it is very hard to see it coming back as much as it won't come back as much as it did under Biden.
So, we've been talking about, 90 trade deals in 90 days. India is also one of the countries where trade negotiations have advanced. So, but in the absence of a trade promotion authority, how do you think the scenario is going to pan out? I mean, one part is to finalize a deal, another is to sign it and implement it. And with the absence of a TPA, how do you see this scenario going on?
They're going to do everything they can without requiring any legislation. And they're trying, I mean, I don't, they'll say Section 232 gives us all the authority, Section 301 gives us all the authority. So they're going to try and get it all done without legislation. Whether that's permissible is a different issue, but they don't care. I mean, they certainly don't seem to care right now. They think they have all the authority they need to put these tariffs into place. And so long as you have the Republican Congress in the House and the Senate, who has not basically put a single check on Donald Trump, they're not going to check him on this either. They're just going to go into effect.
Good morning, Steven. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very meaningful and constructive. My question is not mainly about tariff and all, but do you see this rise of BRICS is a real alternative to this scenario? And do they have a kind of approach to address this kind of issues and the consequences that we are going to face?
So and I'll broaden it out a bit. What alternatives are there to the existing global rules-based trading system now that the U.S. is basically pulling out of it? You have ASEAN, you have the BRICS. Could you use CPTPP? Could it be RCEP? They are all very difficult to do without the United States. And as long as certainly you have the dollar being the world's reserve currency and sanctions all done based on trading with the United States and the ability for the U.S. to sanction or have other types of enforcement, it is hard to see anything replacing that. BRICS, I am certainly. How are you going to have where you're going to have Indonesia is going to work with Saudi Arabia, which is going to work with India, which is going to work with Iran. I mean, it's not any natural coming together. BRICS was coined by Goldman Sachs out of Europe to sell financial to sell financial products. It is not a real industry. Could the EU joining the CPTPP become something? Could India moving into APAC and then doing something? Those types of things may be more realistic, but I don't see the BRICS as being realistic.
I'm Rachel from The Wire China. Prices in the US are going to go up. Do you see a backlash from consumers? Could that limit the moves that Trump could make?
I mean, here's the answer is yes, if prices go up. Their theory is that we are doing two things that are inflationary, and then we're going to do other things that are deflationary, and it is going to wash out. And so tariffs are inflationary, whether the president says so or not. His economic team knows they're inflationary. So tariffs are inflationary, and his immigration deportation policy is inflationary. If you take millions of jobs out of the labor market, and you're going to have labor inflation. in wage inflation. So there's no question that there is inflationary pressures from there. Now, the Trump administration will also say, and we are going to cut taxes, and that's deflationary. And we're going to increase energy investment in the United States, and that's deflationary. And we're going to cut all of these regulations and unshackle business from the burdens of the regulatory state, and it's going to make them more productive, and that is deflationary. So that is their economic model, is that, yes, two things we're doing are inflationary, but on the other hand, everything else we're doing is deflationary. It will actually, they say that the U.S. economy will gain more than it will lose. So that's what we will have to watch, is how much of their prediction is going to come true. Because if what they say is going to be deflationary isn't deflationary, and everything else is inflationary, and the economy takes a hit, and the market goes down, and unemployment goes up, yeah, there's going to be a huge backlash against them. But when will that backlash take place? Will it be offset? That's what we don't know the answer to yet.
I think we have time for one more, if anybody has.
Kimberly from Wall Street Journal. Just a couple of questions. What do you think about Trump's $500 phone? Do you think he'll be able to produce it in the US? And secondly, do you think Powell's job is in trouble because he doesn't want to cut rates?
First one, no. Trump, again, this is one of those things where you say, believe Trump where he can control things, right? Believe him when he says he's going to deport people. When he says, I'm going to build a $500 smartphone in the United States, that's basically impossible right now. So it is not anything that you would want to believe. Will he build it somewhere else and say it's a U.S. service phone? Maybe, but no, I think that's just Trump being Trump. Now, the Powell one is a real serious question, because that is a market mover, right? That is one where Taco could come in, right? Come into play, because if he were to take over the Federal Reserve, that would cause serious issues in financial markets. And so while Donald Trump will say things about Powell, he doesn't have the authority to eliminate him. He has the authority to raise tariffs, or he's using it anyway. He has the authority to deport. He has the authority to order a missile strike against Iran. He does not have the authority to fire Powell. His team knows that this would be bad for the economy. So unless Powell gets sick of having to deal with this, and it doesn't seem like it from everything he says, I would imagine he is going to serve out his term. Taco will happen on that one.
So I think we'll have to leave it there. And as I think we've learned today, the politics of trade are indeed complicated. It's like a Las Vegas game at the moment. But we do thank Steve Okun for making sense of it all and spending the time and sharing his knowledge with us. Please thanks.
Oh, thank you, Kevin.